I now give the floor to Her Excellency Suzi Carla Barbosa, Minister for Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation and Communities of Guinea-Bissau.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, heads of states and governments, ladies and gentlemen. Quero dirigir-me.
First, I would like to address His Excellency Ambassador Tijani Muhammad Bande, President of the 74th Session of the United Nations General Assembly, and convey on behalf of my country and on my own behalf our warmest congratulations on his election to this important position, which dignifies not only his country of Nigeria, but also the entire African continent. Therefore, I would like to reaffirm the unconditional support of Guinea-Bissau during his term. I would also like to thank the United Nations, particularly Secretary General Antonio Guterres, for the attention provided to Guinea-Bissau and for the important contribution from the Integrated United Nations Office for Peacekeeping to our country. Mr. President, the United Nations system, conceived and developed in the aftermath of the last conflicts of the 20th century, again takes on particular relevance with the rising threats of nationalist policies opposed to multilateralism and the values of our organization. Therefore, I congratulate all for the pertinence of the theme chosen for the debate during this session. Indeed, the threats of climate change, terrorism, transnational organized crime, and armed conflicts that ravage many places in the globe will be controlled and eventually overcome only through the joint efforts of the states within the framework of the United Nations. There can be no national or special group interests that come before the interest of preserving our planet and combating organized crime. Your Excellencies, I wish to convey to you the feeling that gives us strength of the Bissau-Guinean society's renewed hope with this new cycle, and to reaffirm the political will and profound commitment of the authorities in my country to the peace, consolidation, and political stabilization process. We look forward to creating sustainable mechanisms for achieving the goals established in our National Development Plan, which is based on and sustained by the Strategic and Operational Plan Terra Arranca, which has been timely submitted to our partners and is hereby reiterated. The government of Guinea-Bissau, under the leadership of His Excellency Aristides Gomes, Prime Minister, has an ambitious governance program that emphasizes reducing poverty, promoting quality education through youth entrepreneurship, and the empowerment of women in order to guarantee a more just and inclusive society. It is our responsibility as the government to create conditions for harmonious and sustainable development. In this regard, Guinea-Bissau fully subscribes to the Political Declaration on Universal Health Coverage, which has been adopted this week by the member states of the United Nations. It is important to note that in 2014, our country adopted a policy that exempts pregnant women and children under 5 from payment for health services. This is a measure of social justice and equity that our government accepts as a duty and responsibility in light of the precarious indicators in this sector. However, for this initiative to be long-lasting, we will need unequivocal and urgent support from our regional and international partners. Your Excellencies, this government, which resulted from the recent legislative elections on March 10th, has engaged in inclusive dialogue and continuous political coordination as priority instruments for the efforts to consolidate political stabilization and create broad consensus around key governance issues. In addition to strengthening the democratic legitimacy of our political institutions, we intend to build the foundations for a better structured and more united society. We pursue such an aspiration on the basis of political agreements that define the general lines of legislative and governmental action, including issues related to structural reform in the state's institutions, constitutional revision, and rebuilding of the economic and social fabric. This vision of compromise and sharing in the resolution of our key problems is evidenced by the parliamentary incidence agreement signed by 5 of the 7 political parties represented in Parliament. In addition to demonstrating the will of Bissau Guineans to walk together for the sake of cohesion and stability, this understanding allowed a plural government to be formed, bringing together national competencies from several areas and convictions. And for the first time, we have achieved absolute gender parity among sector positions. Mr. President, these hopeful signs nevertheless do not hide our condition as an institutionally fragile post-conflict state with sparse financial resources, suffering grave political, economic, environmental, and social consequences. Guinea-Bissau faces a difficult and complex situation with continuing and grave internal and external threats, and we call on the international community to play a central stabilizing role for international monitoring and accountability mechanisms. As a member of this organization, Guinea-Bissau is firmly committed to the United Nations Charter and supports the multilateral systems and mechanisms that promote the cause of peace as a shared public asset. Our country, as a member of the G7+, advocates for the promotion of peace through the sharing of experiences among countries, through national dialogue and reconciliation. 2030 Agenda. Mr. President, organized crime networks continue to pose a grave threat and the risk of undermining the enormous stabilization that joint national efforts supported by the international community have produced. One of the examples of these destabilization attempts is the use of our territory for the transit of illicit drugs, which has been reduced by recent record seizures made in a major operation undertaken by our judiciary police. This demonstration of our government's political will and determination to combat this scourge has deeply affected the political structures that sustain these businesses. We are already seeing and feeling the attacks and intense attempts to compromise the government's process in order to reinstate instability, which favors the status quo that had been in place for so long. This is certainly not a national phenomenon, and it is clear that organized crime takes advantage of the fragility of our states with respect to entrenched local interests. In this regard, it is essential that we strengthen the mechanisms that our main partners use to monitor the political process in Guinea-Bissau. Similarly, it is imperative that our national security and justice institutions receive attention and support from their sub-regional and international counterparts in order to strengthen their capabilities, align with the best practices to defend the universal rights of citizens, both individually and collectively. Ultimately, this is the perfect illustration for the importance of multilateralism, which greatly justifies and elevates the existence of our organization. Your Excellency, many have already cited the original historic reasons for the composition of the United Nations Security Council, which no longer reflect our geopolitical reality. Therefore, I wish to add my country's voice to the appeal to broaden this important part of the United Nations in order to strengthen its legitimacy and representation. From this point of view, and in line with the position of the African Union, Guinea-Bissau advocates for the designation of 2 permanent seats with veto power and 5 non-permanent seats in the Security Council to the African continent. Mr. President, the Sahel region is a perfect illustration of the devastating danger that terrorism poses to the world. Therefore, I would like to take this opportunity to appeal to the international community to create and put in place financing mechanisms to ensure the operational readiness of the G5 Sahel Joint Force, and to face the challenges present in the region, which greatly surpasses the logistical capabilities of those countries. More than a regional threat, it affects the whole continent and may adversely impact world peace. Mr. President, we welcome and encourage the redoubled efforts of United Nations, particularly those of the Secretary General, for the vision and sensitivity with which it has addressed the issue of gender equality within the United Nations system. As an advocate for this cause, Guinea-Bissau wishes to share with this august assembly the historical adoption of the law of parity by the People's National Assembly in Guinea-Bissau in 2018, which establishes a 36% representation of women in elected positions. With the approval of this law, Guinea-Bissau became part of a group of more than 80 countries that have adopted corrective and temporary measures to increase the participation of women in politics and in the spheres of decision-making. Mr. President, I could not fail to express our profound recognition and gratitude to all of our international partners, including the United Nations, the African Union, ECOWAS, CPLP, the European Union, YMU, and the OIF, whose support has been important in monitoring and managing the political transition process, as well as in the legislative elections held in our country in March 2019. Our recognition and gratitude also extend to all countries that, in seeing the need of the brotherly people of Guinea-Bissau, provided important support and extraordinary contributions toward overcoming the crisis in our country. However, this election cycle will be complete only when presidential elections are held. These are scheduled for November 24th. Therefore, we hereby reiterate our appeal for technical and financial assistance from the international community for this important event to take place without any disruptions in the process. Your Excellencies, the Sustainable Development Goals, the new global development paradigm to be established, must be rooted in the people's specific cultures and realities and must draw inspiration from the lessons of the Millennium Development Goals. With respect to climate change, Guinea-Bissau, as a coastal country and archipelago, has a low-lying coastal area 5 meters below sea level on average, which renders our country greatly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Despite the challenges that my country has faced, in a holistic approach to international commitments, we are proud to inform that approximately 27% of our national territory consists of protected areas, thus broadly surpassing Goal 11 of the Aichi and thus rendering Guinea-Bissau as a country of biodiversity, with survival of our populations greatly dependent on such resources. Therefore, we bet on green, inclusive growth that benefits the economy of biodiversity. Our national efforts toward building a resilient society based on our geographic reality were recently recognized by the United Nations Development Programme with the Equator Prize 2019 award for an initiative developed by a national NGO, Tinigena, in collaboration with the government, which consists of using traditional knowledge to protect marine ecosystems and ensure sustainable livelihoods for autochthonous peoples of the Bijagos Islands. Mr. President, I conclude my remarks by reiterating our gratitude to the United Nations and by recognizing the role that the Peacebuilding Commission has played in supporting the political stabilization and government process in my country. Bissau Guineans are determined to turn a new page in our history and return to our history of honor and dignity, but aware that in this phase we will continue to need the assistance and monitoring of the community of our international partners even more. Guinea-Bissau is mobilized to transform our territory into a space of peace and human security, open to all peoples of the world that wish to build a more fraternal, safe, welcoming, and progressive society with all peoples and cultures. Thank you very much.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation and Communities of Guinea-Bissau.